Did you miss us? This is Rosemary Armeo with On the Brink, and we've been off a bit, off the air a bit, what with Easter and, that big eclipse that we had to attend to. But we're back now, and we want to update you on two big, hot, and very scary conflict zones. Believe it or not, we have not talked in depth here about Ukraine, which is now a 2-year-old war since last December. It's been even longer for a program on Gaza, where the fighting and suffering are about 6 months old. I truly wish I could tell you that since we stopped talking about these two places, things have quieted. That is definitely not the case. And here to talk with me about that are two old colleagues from the WAMC Roundtable, Jim Ketterer and Mark Wittman. Jim is, you'll see how smart and knowledgeable he is in a minute. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College. He has lived and worked throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, most recently in Egypt. And Mark Wittman, well, if this were SNL, Mark would soon be getting a jacket to commemorate how many times he's been on the podcast. He's the best Wall Street investment bank right now, also the only one. They bring a unique and very informed perspective. So let's get started talking about what's going on, I think, in Ukraine and with Russia. Jim, it does not look like the U.S. has moved forward at all. In fact, the Republican Party in the House is in more of a mess than ever. So they've not moved forward with getting more aid, to push more U.S. aid to Ukraine. So what happens if it is not forthcoming, if it never gets fixed?
Yeah, well, number one, it's good to be on the podcast. So thanks for inviting me. And we have two heavy topics today, but very important topics. And I think that the topic of Ukraine, as you said, we're 2 years into the war. I do worry that there's a little fatigue on the part of Americans, and if they're not against the idea of continuing to support Ukraine, it's just sort of fading out of the news. Gaza and other things have taken it over. The campaign here that's ramping up for the elections in November. But I think it still remains crucially important for what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and what it means going forward for the maintenance of what's left of the international rules-based order going forward. In terms of what's going on in the House and aid, I think that the speaker is or just has gone to Mar-a-Lago to visit with Donald Trump. And I think it's also, they're going to be talking about election integrity, but I think also trying to mend some fences within that GOP caucus on Ukraine. And Trump also came out a few days ago and said something very interesting. He talked about the possibility of the deal that he's been talking about and how he could end the conflict right away. And the thing that he outlined is very similar to what is being floated in Washington as a deal if the U.S. should not continue with aid and really be in a position, the U.S. and NATO, to have to kind of nudge the Ukrainians toward negotiating the conflict and not press on for outright victory. And so, not to give Donald Trump a lot of credit, but it's not what he said wasn't out of line with this fight that's happening. And it's really a bipartisan fight that's happening among the foreign policy community in DC about whether to press on and to have the Ukrainians press on, despite all that's going on the battlefield, and we can and should talk about that, or to negotiate. And the outlines of the negotiated agreement would be, not a big surprise compared to what we thought from the very beginning of this conflict. Sorry, Rosemary, go ahead.
No. I want Mark to jump in here because he has spoken before. We have talked about this. Are we in a situation now where we're just waiting for Ukrainians to accept the hard and awful truth that they are going to lose some land at the very least to Russia?
Rosemary, I've always thought since the beginning of this conflict that it would inevitably end with the Ukrainians ceding land. I think Zelensky, given the way his politics works, won't admit that for two reasons. One is you don't want to weaken your hand and with Russia. And secondly, I don't think his populace is there yet. But in the absence of U.S. military aid, I think there's a real chance that some of the Ukrainian defensive positions are overrun this summer. And that, as we saw before, when the Russians get a hold of towns with populations in them, they commit terrible atrocities. And I think on the back of that, at some point in this war, the Ukrainians were going to be in the mood to give territory. If indeed the U.S. doesn't step up and there are significant losses, the Ukrainians will be willing to give up more territory sooner. But the problem is, I think, with that quote unquote solution is, once you mark a line and say to the Russians, you can't go over this, what do you do to enforce that part of the agreement? I think giving up land is the easy part. Demarking lines that Russia stays on the other side of is the really difficult part, particularly in a situation where the U.S. has walked away from the fight.
Right. And this is not the first time we've walked away. So I was in Ukraine in 2014, and I was there shortly after the Russians had taken or taken back, depending on your perspective, Crimea. And I was there for an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe election monitoring mission, and it was an enormous mission, and people from all of the 57 member states, and all of them were really quite aware of the fact that the United States, the UK, Russia, and Ukraine had signed on to the Budapest Memorandum that was basically saying Ukraine, that had inherited some weapons, nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, would give them back to Russia, and in return, they would get an agreement that the territory of Ukraine would not be at all encroached upon. And so when Crimea was taken, this sent the signal that, something ought to happen. And we really didn't do anything.
Right.
And the signal of doing pretty much nothing was not lost on our new NATO alliance members, particularly in the Baltic states, who said, well, if you're not going to do anything about that, I mean, what about Article 5 of the NATO Charter that says, an attack on one is an attack on all, and that if we were attacked in Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, you should come to our aid. And they pretty much said straight out, we simply don't believe that you will. So that signaling, unfortunately, continues, and we lose all kinds of leverage. As you said, Mark, if we walk away, we have really very little standing to be able to say, well, Ukraine, you ought to be able to do this, and you should accept this, etc. Or to say to the Russians, you should stay behind that line, because also the devil is in the details. So what lines?
Right.
Who is going to administer the daily life within these new Russian territories? Will it be the Russian government? Will the Donbass, the southeast of Ukraine, be administered by an international protectorate? How is that all going to work? And I think another key part of the deal would have to be deciding in one way or another, what is the future of possible NATO membership for Ukraine? Because this was a key trigger in starting this conflict.
That would definitely be part of the negotiations. But is the value of NATO worth as much? It's like the reputation of the United States. If we go into negotiations after we've given up on an outright victory, which at one point seemed, at the beginning, it seemed impossible. Then it seemed like, wow, they're going to really do it. Then we pulled back. It was the United States pulling back that's changed this. It's made us now be talking about deals. I still can't believe that we're giving Putin literally a free hand to work his will to endanger all of Eastern Europe right now. If he moves into any part of Ukraine permanently, he's closer to our NATO. He's closer, and he's achieved now, it would be twice after Crimea, he has achieved his goals. It's just a disaster that I don't see any upside for the U.S. The only upside of a deal is that, of course, it ends hideous suffering for Ukrainians, and that's no small thing.
Oh, Rosemary, I disagree.
Okay, go ahead.
I think the Ukrainian.
Sorry, I want to say who you are. This is Mark Wittman you're listening to. Go ahead.
I think the Ukrainians go into resistance mode, And I don't think their suffering will be any less. You and I have talked about many times, there's not a modern example of when a foreign country takes over and there isn't a resistance that loses. The resistances persist indefinitely. It took 20 years in Afghanistan, but they kicked us out, and they had kicked the Russians out after 10 years. The Ukrainians will go into a resistance mode and lead a terrible existence.
Yes.
We will draw artificial lines on a map. We will make assurances to Ukraine, and Putin will call the question again.
Yep.
He will use the excuse of the resistance at some point once he has re-mustered his forces to call the question again and to keep going. This is what Roosevelt knew before World War II, and sadly, a lesson we haven't learned. If we don't take care of it now, it's going to get more expensive for the Ukrainians and far more expensive for the rest of the world.
I do not see us disagreeing, Mark. I think I not only believe all of that, but it also gives a go-ahead. It's a signal, as in the terminology of Jim, it's a signal to China that they too can go get what they want. This is just opening up an entire new scramble for new places in the world, new territory in the world.
I think we've already given.
Would have won.
I think we've already given China that signal. Given that for the U.S. to effectively defend Taiwan, we would have to be in a shooting war in order to hold China at bay for any amount of time. The Chinese can now and have now safely concluded there is no way that we will defend Taiwan in a meaningful way. That horse is out of the barn.
Yeah. And I would also say that the Chinese have concluded, and I think the U.S. Navy has concluded, that we would have a hard time defending it, even if we really brought a great amount of force to bear. The Chinese advancements in anti-ship ballistic missiles is really astounding and really puts the Navy on the defensive, the U.S. Navy. That shooting war would be very different than the kinds of shooting wars we've been involved in, countering insurgencies, urban combat. I mean, that would be a major naval battle where we would have the real chance of losing. I mean, outright losing that battle. And that would be a shock to the American system. I just want to say a couple other things, though, about, well, I would also say one other thing about China and signaling. So the current state visit of the Japanese to Washington is certainly also a signal about ramped up alliances. And you hear the Japanese prime minister talking about Japan really taking its place back in the international community and on the world stage in a major way, which includes a continued defense buildup, which we saw before under Abe and is happening even more. So there's that. But back to Ukraine, I just want to say there's a couple of other moving parts on this that are likely to get ugly no matter what happens this summer. One is, within NATO, you have disagreements. The conflict had the effect of bringing NATO together and giving it more of a raison d'etre than it has had since the end of the Cold War in the first year or so. But now that we're dragging on for quite some time, you start to see people like French President Emmanuel Macron saying out loud that maybe what it would take is NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. And then you had the Putin regime responding with nuclear saber rattling.
Right.
So
right.
That's just a glimmer into, I think, how things will play out over the summer. The second thing is that we've had leverage over Ukraine. We've said to them, listen, we're going to give you X, Y, and Z weapons. These are some pretty advanced weaponry. But one of the things we don't want you to do is fire a lot of these weapons into Russia proper, because that will tip the balance in the direction of what the Biden administration has been trying to hold off, which would otherwise be known as the potential toward massive escalation. So with losing that leverage and with the Ukrainians becoming more and more desperate, I think you would see both using advanced weaponry and also carrying out just attacks, car bombs, etc., in Russia itself. And this really would have the chance to have the likelihood of having things really spin out of control even more.
You're listening to Jim Ketterer, Senior Fellow at Bard College. We're going to take a break here for a minute, but we are not done with this topic. Segments of On the Brink can be heard weekly on the Hudson Mohawk Magazine. That's a feature of WOOC Radio 105.3 FM. The magazine is a volunteer-produced local news hour that airs discussion and debate about topics that affect our world. And you know we are interested in adding to that kind of talk. Please listen to On the Brink in full on Apple, YouTube, Google, Spotify. Oh, just think of another podcast platform because we're there too. And help us to get more sponsors and more high-quality programming by liking us, rating us, and engaging with us. This is all free to you, by the way. I'm asking for your love, not your dollars. The Apple Barn and Bake Shop is opening for business again this weekend, April 20th. That is really good news for pastry lovers. It's also the day on the 20th of the Maple in April event. From 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. you can shop in their indoor market. It's going to be filled with all kinds of maple-inspired stuff, from syrup to candy to candles. I don't know. It's all locally sourced, and it celebrates Vermont's heritage. That's what the Apple Barn is all about. You can, of course, still buy, as always, the barn's legendary pies and donuts. And then you might want to stick around for a post-festival silent disco. I'm not exactly sure what that is. They say it's something unique, embodying the spirit of community, sustainability, and celebration. I am in. More details can be found on the Apple Barn's Facebook page. Hi, this is Rosemary Armeo, and we're back on with Jim Ketterer of Bard College and investment Wall Street banker Mark Wittman. We were talking about what has truly become a mess in Ukraine. We have backed down from previous offers of help at all costs. Seem to be doing that in Gaza too, but we'll get to that in a minute. And President Zelensky of Ukraine, has also come in for some criticism that we have not seen up to this point in the 2 years of war. Mark, you noted this too. Why has he not groomed a suitable number two? Why have there been delays in legislation expanding conscription in Ukraine? Why are so few soldiers deployed in Ukraine? What's going on? And is it all the U.S.'s fault, the Republicans in the U.S., for problems with the military operation in Ukraine? What do you think, Mark?
Well, there's a U.S. general who's overseeing military operations in Europe who had a great quote this week, and he said, "The side that can't shoot back loses." And so if the United States backs down and Ukraine is overrun, I do think it will have been our fault. But I do think it's worth asking what is going on in the Ukraine with respect to Zelensky. It still surprises me that he hasn't groomed a number two, particularly given the pall of risk that looms over his head on a daily basis. I do think if you look back in history, he's probably of the mindset that there was only one Churchill, one Stalin, and one Roosevelt, one de Gaulle, and all the rest. And if you look at Ukraine before the war, Rosemary, as you well know, this wasn't a land of selfless patriots with wings on their backs. It was a pretty tough place with a lot of political infighting and a lot of corruption. It was a democracy learning how to function as a democracy. And you're certainly seeing some of the fissures within the working state show when you have a country that on paper has a 900,000 person strong military and has only mustered about 300,000 of those to the front. And now there's a bill going through the Ukrainian parliament to expand conscription, and it's been subject to over 1,000 amendments.
Right.
So I think what you're seeing is a legacy of a democracy that frankly was certainly westward leaning, but was by no means perfect, and free of corruption, nor free of cults of personality. And I think you're seeing some of those effects come to the fore now that the dust has settled, and we're taking a hard, cold look at where the Ukrainian government sits in all this.
So Jim, what do you think if there were less corruption and more experience with democracy and, for that matter, governance? What does Zelensky know about it? He was an actor, although we have some of the same issues, don't we, in the United States? If there had been a more practiced democracy, do you think this war might have gone a different way? Is it all again blamable on the U.S. faltering U.S. aid?
No, I don't think it's all to the blame of the U.S. At all. And I think every country has its own domestic politics, and under this level of pressure, you're going to see all kinds of fissures and all kinds of dysfunctions that were already there, amplified and exacerbated, and we certainly see that. And so I don't know if it really has to do with the health of their institutions necessarily, though. I mean, I'm worried about the health of institutions everywhere, including here at home. I think conscription in this day and age is such a tough political issue to deal with, and we have a history of draft riots and all kinds of things here in the United States as well. So I think that all things that Mark said are certainly things that need to be looked into, and I certainly hope that the heads of NATO and that our national security people are talking to the Ukrainians all the time on these various issues. But at the same time, who really would have thought that Zelensky would have been able to step up and perform as well as he has up to this point, and not just perform in terms of public speaking and representing the country, but really guiding it through what many people expected to be an absolute, overrunning by the Russians in a matter of a few weeks. And so there's been one surprise after another in Ukraine, and there's been all kinds of positive surprises in the Ukrainians' ability to be resilient and to not only fight back, but to adjust to current circumstances and, not completely give up the ship. So my money is still on Zelensky. If it is possible from NATO, from the other European partners in NATO, from the United States in general, to come up with something. I mean, I think that there are Republicans, by the way, who are truly concerned about this situation and are speaking out about it now. And you really do see some breaks in the Republican Party over this issue.
I'm sorry, I have no patience with this view that, there's some breaks and people are changing, and privately they say something different. The Republican Party has not performed on this issue and has stymied the entire country. And that starts with Trump's last term, when he used Zelensky as a tool in his war against the Biden family. And held hostage and all that has been Ukraine. And missing is a view that our own national security is tied up with Ukraine. I have said from the beginning, I don't understand why we weren't talking, as Macron is now, about involving NATO at the very beginning. This seems to be an actual affront to American interests.
What, you mean NATO troops on the ground?
Yeah, if you'll remember, Biden ruled that out at the beginning. There will be no boots on the ground. He ruled it completely out at the start. I understand a message to Russia, blah, blah, blah. But Russia has used this threat of strategic nuclear weapons very effectively. And the result has been there is a weakened United States. Mark, you want to jump in here, I know.
Well, a couple things. Jim, I too respect Zelensky for what he's done, but that's different than saying he hasn't made errors. If you look at the issue of conscription, the Russians have solved it partially through coercion, but actually also through offering new recruits incredible pay packages.
That's
right. And Ukraine could emulate that. Rosemary, I don't think it was ever the case that we would have put boots on the ground, and here's why. We don't put U.S. soldiers into shooting galleries, and until you have air superiority, Ukraine is a shooting gallery. In order to get air superiority, NATO could achieve that in a few weeks.
Yes.
But we would so weaken Russia that we would have put Putin in the position where he really was in an existential crisis, basically with no way to stop NATO forces from advancing on the Kremlin. And we can't put him in that situation unless we have to. And so it made all the sense in the world to use the Ukrainians to fight, particularly given how capable they proved themselves.
I don't disagree, but now we're not letting the Ukrainians do that.
I agree. And one last point, I was at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Museum this weekend. Before World War II, he was metaphorically, pulling out his hair. If you remember the Four Freedoms,
right.
The Four Freedoms speech, believe it or not, was actually a State of the Union address that he gave to Congress before it was clear the United States would join the war. Mm-hmm. And if we haven't learned that lesson, we are going to pay as a country and as a world a dear price to stop Putin later, as opposed to having the Ukrainians stop him now.
Go ahead, Jim. We do need to move on to Gaza, but I want one last question here on Ukraine, and it's this. If the election goes to the Republicans, if Trump is president, what happens in Ukraine? Brief description. Start with Jim.
Well, I think he's already pretty much said it out loud. And I do think that there's a fair amount of support in Washington and kind of the permanent foreign policy community, the so-called blob, that for that position to lean on the Ukrainians to accept a negotiated settlement. But as I said, the devil is in the details, and these are details that Trump did not deliver in his off-the-cuff remarks about this. So I think there would be a negotiated deal. I think that there probably would be an agreement that Ukraine would not join NATO, and that if Trump were to be president, probably the southeastern part of Ukraine would just be swallowed up by Russia. It would not be kind of an international protectorate or something like that, which is another one of the things that has been promoted as a part of a negotiated settlement.
And how about you, Jim? If Trump gets in, what do you see happening for Ukraine?
I agree with Jim. I frankly think the Ukrainians' defensive positions will be overrun. It will be a bloody summer. The Ukrainians will capitulate, and there will be a temporary halt while Russia is allowed to reload and then continue its march, perhaps after the tenure of Donald Trump is over. But it's going to be gruesome.
But one thing I'm going to say in the run-up to the decision that Americans have to make in November is that both candidates, I think, and congressional candidates across the country should be pressed on their position on this, no matter what party they're from, whether they're an incumbent or they're a challenger or whatever. Constituents should really press people on it. And this is one of those elections that I think is where foreign policy is going to matter, and it usually doesn't. But I think in this case, on this and the next topic we're going to talk about. And I also think that although the Biden administration has done a good job of balancing between supporting the Ukrainians, but at the same time, not starting World War III, what I don't think they've done a good job on is articulating very clearly to Americans, why is this in our national security interest?
Right.
You can't just say that and leave it at that. You really need to get into details and say specifically, this is why. And in the absence of that, I think people are just simply going to either forget about it or not agree with it and say, it sounds wishy-washy.
Oh, that's a criticism that I have to cop to. I just did that and said, it's clearly in our national interest, and did not explain why I thought so.
Well, you're not running for president.
No, that's true. And we need to take a break now, so I'm still not going to do it. We'll be back in a minute. Karen's Place has got a deal for you. Owner Jenny Dewar, who is a friend and who has been on this podcast in the past, is offering a special discount to would-be renters who mention On the Brink when they make a reservation. Karen's Place, I know you've heard me tell you about this, is a magical 8,000 square foot mansion in a wooded glen near Bennington, Vermont. Honestly, I'm going to say the same thing in the fall. I'm warning you now, but here we go. You could not pick a better time of year to schedule a family reunion than right now. not just family reunions, parties, company retreats, even just a restful weekend away. It's an explosion of budding trees, colorful flowers, all these scampering creatures in the trees. It's really just breathtaking. So look up orchardairllc.com. That's orchardairllc.com. You'll get photos, pricing, availability, and you'll also see that I am not exaggerating about the coolness of this place. This is On the Brink, and we're talking with Jim Ketterer of Bard College and Mark Wittman of Wall Street, investment banker. We have been talking about Ukraine. I want to move now quickly. There's just so much to talk about on all these topics, but we need to talk about Gaza. And I want to start with Netanyahu. How much trouble is he really in? Jim, you're the expert on this, so I'm going to start with Mark first and then switch to you.
That's not
Yeah,
fair.
I let you. Yeah, you have to prove yourself here.
I'm not an expert anyway.
I actually think we're at an impasse in this. I don't think that Hamas is going to give up the hostages because it's the only defense the leadership has against almost certain death. I don't think the Israelis are going to agree to a meaningful ceasefire because I don't think the country's behind it, and certainly the far right part of Netanyahu's government isn't behind it. So I think we're at a bit of an impasse, and I think Netanyahu is exactly where he wants to be because he wants to delay this for as long as he can. I also think his position explains why he's dropping bombs on Iranian, let's call them office buildings adjacent to embassies in Syria, because he's got his big muscular brother still with military assets in the Gulf. And so he's willing to poke at the other bully in the yard more than he might otherwise be willing to. And if that starts things flaring up with Iran and leaves this even more protracted, I think Netanyahu's in a position where he likes that. I think in the face of this, the U.S. has to be almost merciless about forcing the Israelis to fulfill their humanitarian obligations. I think sadly, it took the death of foreigners to put us there, but I think the Biden government's getting close. And I do think we need to provide the Israelis with a roadmap. I think it's absolutely untenable to ask the Israelis not to go after the final strongholds in Hamas. If that was bin Laden in there, and he still had American hostages after 9/11. You bet the United States would want to finish that off. Now, I think we have to do it like it was done in Mosul when they were clearing out ISIS, which means you're going to have to pull up a lot of, you're going to have to call up a lot of Israeli military backup. You're going to have to sort through over 1 million people before you enter the conflict. I do think there is a way for the United States to manage Israel through this, but to answer your question about Netanyahu, I think he's maneuvered this to almost exactly where he wants it, which is a stalemate that's going to take a long time to unravel from here.
So your answer to my question is that despite the protests, despite the obvious anger and upset with his incompetence or worse, he's safe for now because it's such a bad situation.
Yeah, and I think you have to keep in mind, even if he were to himself call the question and say, okay, I'm done, that's a 3-month delay between when a next government takes place. And even the moderates fear what the far right within his coalition would do during that time. They haven't called for elections more broadly because of Chuck Schumer. They've done it because they literally can't find an opening as to when they would or wouldn't do it. Netanyahu, as I say, Netanyahu's got himself in the best position he could possibly be at this point.
Yeah. Jim, talk about Netanyahu, and you're right, Mark. Chuck Schumer, who has never said a bad word about Israel, has even praised Trump when it comes to Israel. He's such a loyalist. Even he felt brave enough to condemn Netanyahu. His own people have come out in record numbers to protest against him. He's extremely arrogant and despicable man. He is no Zelensky. And yet, is it true that he's in for quite some time yet still in Israel, in your view?
Well, yeah, there's all kinds of people, and even before October 7th, there were all kinds of people who were sick of Netanyahu and wanted to see him go. And I mean, people in Israel. So we've seen more and more of this after the initial shock of October 7th was over. Then, people really started to say, number one, Netanyahu and his government are responsible for a colossal security failure.
Right.
That it's not just that Hamas carried this out, but that they were able to carry it out. And that with a small patch of land that is absolutely surrounded by the most advanced technological gear and one of the most sophisticated intelligence and security forces that on the face of the planet, that Hamas was able to do this with bulldozers and hang gliders. Israelis are just absolutely beside themselves that Netanyahu's deal with them basically was, well, I might be a very unpleasant person and unpalatable to you politically, but I can keep you safe.
Right.
And so he's remained unpleasant and unpalatable, but he hasn't
And now he's kept them safe. That's very well done.
and so that's one thing. Um, and really Netanyahu himself in this particular arrangement of the government and this cabinet is really held hostage by the very far right. And I have seen, every time Netanyahu starts to give in a little or show some level of understanding of what the Americans are saying to him, that you almost immediately get Smotrich and Ben Gvir and others like that who jump in and say, we need to press on, we need to do X, Y, and Z in the kind of most maximalist approach to this, which was, I think, always a mistake. It doesn't make Israelis safer. It's not rooting out Hamas. It's in fact increasing support for Hamas. I think it's an absolute fantasy to think that some kind of operation in southern Gaza and Rafah is going to kind of like permanently eliminate Hamas. You've actually created more Hamas sympathizers in the West Bank in the last 6 months than ever existed. So without any political horizon being articulated by the Netanyahu government, with them being held hostage by the right wing, but in the absence of any other clear alternative, maybe Benny Gantz, but nothing has really built up a head of steam there. It seems that he's the very worst of a lot of bad alternatives at the moment.
Oh, it sounds like Trump you're describing. Oh my goodness.
Well, you can connect that dot as you like.
Exactly. You brought up the West Bank, which is my next question. I have been worried as I watch what appears to be some sort of a pullback from Gaza, and I have never thought it was Israel giving up. I think it's redirecting or redeploying forces towards Lebanon. Do you see that as a possibility? I sure do. I'm worried about that.
Toward Lebanon.
Yeah, where there are also terrorist force against them, Hezbollah.
Yeah. I mean, Hezbollah and the Israelis have been playing a tit for tat game for a long time.
And it's been escalating. It's been escalating while the world's been distracted by Gaza.
It has been, but Israel has been down that road before, literally down that awful road of invading, boots on the ground in Lebanon, and it created a national cataclysm for Israelis. I mean, it was, horrible. I mean, I think one of the things that was a result of that quagmire that they entered into was the creation of an emboldened and very dangerous Hezbollah. They ended up creating the very thing that they were there to fight against, and we can see this being replicated now in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. So, I think that there might be some increased activity, but I don't really think that Israel is going to take this extra step and escalate it fully into Lebanon. And I am certain that the Americans behind closed doors are saying, absolutely do not do this. That would be.
Yeah, they're also saying watch for Iran, and we saw what happened with the bombing of the Iranian embassy.
Yeah, you mentioned the West Bank, though. I mean, what's happening there? What was happening even before October 7th? Over in the life of this current Israeli government, settlers basically were green lighted to engage in very aggressive, violent displacement of people, violating what was already kind of a Swiss cheese arrangement of areas A, B, and C across the West Bank, making it even a more unlivable situation for Palestinians, a very explosive situation. And since October 7th, it's gone even more, I mean, exponentially, just off the charts. And it's really getting very little attention. There was just a decision to appropriate, I think, 2,000 acres of land. And there's been more and more and more of this going on. So again, I think this is the right-wing part of the Netanyahu government that is trying to create facts on the ground that will be almost impossible to undo after the fact.
Mark, let me give you a chance to get in here. I want you to take on an even bigger question, and that is there a possibility that of all of this terrorism and suffering and famine and just the whole horrible mess, that we could end up with the two-state solution, where there would be something for Palestinians and something for Israelis?
I think Anthony Blinken suffers from delusions when he says that within the foreseeable future, he's going to have a credible path to a two-state solution. If he does that, they should name the Peace Prize, and frankly, they can name every other prize given from every high school and college in this country after Anthony Blinken. If you think about it, at the beginning of this war, Netanyahu said he was going to destroy Hamas. That was a promise he was never going to keep. And simultaneously, the United States had thoughts of grandeur that it was never going to fulfill. I think it is inevitable, given the Israeli disposition, and I think we as Americans, if you think back to 9/11 and imagine a case where the Taliban had taken hostages, for God's sake, I think it's inevitable that they'll have to sort it out militarily in Rafah. I think we as the United States should use our suasion to make sure that the Gazans are treated humanely, and this is more of a Mosul than some other type of situation. I think it's also inevitable that we're going to have to bring Iran. You have to bring Hezbollah to the table and therefore Iran to the table before you get everybody in neutral corners, because there are I think it's 100 and some thousand Israelis that are displaced because of the threat of missile attacks from Lebanon currently. So I think the United States has to help Israel manage through this. And by the way, this is what the Israeli government told us they were going to do. They told us there was going to be a massive incursion. Then they were going to pull back on the periphery of Gaza, but they wanted free reign to conduct, selective or surgical military strikes. So this is going according to their plan by and large, although they haven't gotten the hostages back, but no one should be surprised by that. I think until Rafah is basically been searched and Iran has had a, come to your religious deity of choice moment and calm things down so that the Israelis can move back, I don't think the Americans can do anything but manage the situation as best they can. Once that's all happened, then we can talk about, longer term solutions and all the rest of it. But I think Anthony Blinken doomed his own efforts with aspirations of grandeur at the beginning of this. And by when I say Blinken, I mean the administration generally.
The administration, he spoke for them. Jim, you concur, or do you have a different view?
Well, for quite a few years, no one in any place other than Washington, D.C. had any thought about the two-state solution. It was among certainly Netanyahu and the people supporting him. He has never been supportive of that, and he's been very vocal
Absolutely,
years not being supportive of it, and has worked against any possibility that it would happen. And Palestinians have largely given up on it being anything remotely like two actual states.
Right.
And that it would be, at the very best, it would be some kind of Bantustan or something like that, which is completely unacceptable. So, understandably so. So, it's been dead on arrival. We have seen it come back into conversation in a way. And I would say one glimmer, a kind of hope about it coming back into conversation is not that it's necessarily going to end up as a likely direct result of this conflict, this immediate conflict. But I think there are more and more people realizing, well, we have to think of some sort of political horizon on this. I mean, it can't just be tactical issues of Rafah and what's happening there and how many troops are moving there and what are the settlers doing in the West Bank. In the absence of it, not just for the sake of the Palestinians, though of course I think that's hugely important, but also if you're an Israeli, you should be saying, we cannot live in a situation where this is a constant kind of military operation after military operation that is done by us or to us, back and forth. This is no way for Israel to exist. So on the Israeli side of things, on the Palestinian side of things, everyone is, I think, everyone of any sense and any goodwill is saying, well, we have to come up with something. And then the question is, well, what is the something? And again, the devil is in the details. I want to just say, though, that there are some people, shockingly, not shockingly, who are not of goodwill. And I will tell you that one of the things that was floated to me by some people at the very beginning of this conflict, and I really dismissed it at first as just kind of a crazy fever dream. But with the way that Netanyahu continues to say, we're going to carry out these operations in Rafah, this is going to happen no matter what, I'm starting to believe it. And that is the following scenario, that there are those people in Israel, and there's people on the other side of the border in Rafah in Egypt, and there are some in Washington who are thinking, well, really what should happen is that a humanitarian crisis of even greater proportions than what we already have will be created in southern Gaza. And under the heading of this crisis, and as a humanitarian gesture, many Palestinians will be moved into the Sinai on the Egyptian side of things.
Right, right.
And when that happens, you can be pretty darn sure they're not coming back. I mean, there was an interview maybe 2 weeks ago, or perhaps a bit more, where Jared Kushner was saying that, there's some great real estate in Gaza. And what we really need to do is kind of, clear it out and just start again. Well, what does clear it out mean? When we hear Smotrich or Ben-Gvir talking about clear it out, they're less subtle and they're not jokey about a real estate deal. They're just talking about ethnic cleansing. And then you've got Egyptians on the other side of that border who are basically being paid off to the tune of like $50 billion from the international community to be receptive to fever ideas like this. And there are people in Washington, not just Jared Kushner, who are floating them. So it's one of those things I thought was so crazy and so horrible that it couldn't possibly be true. And this nightmare continues to metastasize. And I don't know if it's going to end up being true, but there are enough people floating it and enough people in power trying to make it happen that I'm concerned.
Oh my God, you guys, I have missed it so much. This has been an amazing conversation. I feel like we just began and I'm horrified looking at the clock. We're going to need to cut away and take a break. We'll come back for last thoughts from each one for our toast. On the Brink is brought to you by the Donna Frank team of luxury property specialists at Berkshire Hathaway Blake Realtors. This team, once again, this year is winning all kinds of awards for record sales, and its listings have grown. This guarantees that future records are within their grasp. Donna is an old friend from my WAMC days, and I can vouch for her skill, energy, her real estate expertise. So check out the Donna Frank team on Facebook, or contact her at donnafed, DONAFED, @gmail.com. Well, I have to tell you that the Stoners are back from shooting the solar eclipse. They have added new photographs proving this to their collection on nature logs. Denise and Scott Stoner are naturalists and photographers local to the Albany area. Eclipses have become one of their specialties. This is the one in April was their third set, the first so close to their home. They had originally planned, I think I told you about this, to head out to Texas where they expected clear skies. When clouds started moving in, they ditched those plans and hightailed it instead to New England. It's quite a great travel story, but it was successful. They did capture the eclipse. And on naturelogs.com, let me spell that for you, naturelogues.com, you can see the proof. There are new pictures as well as their collection of amazing old ones. And you can buy note cards, prints, and other specialty items there. Thank you for checking them out. You won't be sorry. I'm sad to say we've come almost to the end of this edition of On the Brink. I want to ask Jim Ketterer of Bard College and Mark Wittman of Wall Street to give some last thoughts on the discussion we've had on both Gaza and Ukraine and the war around the world, basically. And then we'll make a toast. Jim, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, that we've tackled some pretty heavy things, and there's no way to talk about them without really doing so with a sense of doom and gloom, and that's fitting and appropriate for both of these topics. But I do think that there are, as I was saying in the previous segment, that there are some glimmers of hope. I do think in Ukraine that NATO and the United States have balanced things appropriately so, and if we can make our way through this question of the House of Representatives and aid, I do feel somewhat optimistic that that even if we get to a negotiated settlement there, it will be one that would be much more in favor of the Ukrainians than what we're currently looking at. And on the questions with Palestinians and Israelis, I also think that things have gotten to such a nightmarish state that if it's not the two-state solution, there are enough people who are discussing and pondering, well, what could we really do with this situation? What could we make of it? And we've seen in the past when wars have been carried out in the Middle East that they have turned into very surprising peace deals like the Camp David Accords. So I'd like to remain hopeful on some level that at least in the medium term, we can see such results.
Okay. Mark Wittman, you get the penultimate point to make here.
I'm not hopeful in the intermediate term, but I'm hopeful in the long run. And I'm hopeful because somebody, when talking about Gaza, asked me the question of what do you think a 10-year-old boy or girl does when they see their family eliminated and all the suffering. And immediately you think to their militaristic reaction. And history shows you that people like Gandhi or King distinguish themselves because under circumstances that are unspeakable, they come up with different answers and help lead nations to better solutions. And frankly, I think it's about that 10-year time frame that I hope to God that some 10-year-old now is thinking about a response other than violence that really will lead us in a way that we haven't thought of and help to bring clarity and peace to a situation that I think unfortunately will remain turbulent for quite some time.
And I just want to say that, I love what Mark just said, and I'm really buoyed by that. And there are people on both sides of this conflict in the Middle East say basically the same phrase, from your lips to God's ears. Yasmin min bu'ik Rabbina in Arabic. And I hope so. I very much hope so.
Well, I'm going to bring everybody down after them because I get it's one of the privileges of hosts. I get the ultimate final word. And mine is doom and gloom. We're killing humanitarian workers. We are working with Ukrainians to accept a solution that they fought for 2 years against, and that we told them we would help them to avoid. And we're back there again. I don't see anything hopeful in this. And the fact that we could end up with the Donald Trump in office and an administration that would support destruction of both Palestinian hopes and Ukrainian dreams, it doesn't matter what the 10-year-old is making. That world is going to be gone by the time he's there. So I want to make a toast to clear thinking, which seems to be lacking right now in all of these countries, in Israel, in the United States for sure, in Ukraine, in Russia. We have reverted to an earlier time that I thought we had passed, that we had grown up out of, and now we're back into it. So clear thinking. What does it mean to have our national security endangered? I think that I love that point that you made earlier, Jim. And why is it not self-evident? Why do we have to explain it? And so on that dreary note, we're going to end this. I love the conversation. I hope that we'll see you again soon, guys. Okay. Thank you so much.